Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science Friday and Black In Neuro watch party. We are watching Breakthrough, the Trauma Tracer today. I am Diana Montano. I am the events producer for Science Friday.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rakib Tesfaye. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University, and I'm also an organizer of Black In Neuro. So before we continue with the event, it's important that we start off by acknowledging the history of the lands on which we are all joining from and meeting from today. Canada, the US, countries around the world are home to many different Indigenous peoples, and we ask that you each take a moment to research, learn about them, and reflect upon the Indigenous peoples whose lands we are currently on. For example, I'm in Toronto, and we are located on traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, a territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties that falls within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And as we convene with digital spaces that may seem neutral, we must also recognize our extreme privilege to occupy these spaces, while up to 2/3 of First Nations communities in Canada continue to lack basic internet access, and we can see similar statistics around the world. And failure to provide this basic human right is just one extension of colonialist oppression that we must reckon with and contribute to dismantling. And so just a reminder for friends in the US that Monday is Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a holiday, so we hope that you take this opportunity to celebrate and honor Native American peoples' histories and culture.
Thank you, Rakib. I really appreciate that. So we're going to get started in just a few minutes, but I think a lot of you are probably wondering, where are we? What are we doing here today? So today we are going to be watching a film called Breakthrough, the Trauma Tracer, which stars Bianca Jones Marlin, who also will be joining us in a post-viewing conversation about what it is like to do the work that she does. So if during that conversation you have any questions that you'd like to ask Bianca, feel free to put them in the chat, no matter where you are. We are streaming to both Facebook and YouTube today. And so we are able to see your comments with us. So if you have any questions, that the comments is a great place to put them, and we'll be answering your questions with Bianca along the way. So I want to tell you a little bit about Science Friday. Science Friday originally started as a program for the radio, and we've been around for almost 30 years now, but we're much more than just the radio. Like we are today, we meet for events. We have education. We have an education department that creates amazing STEM resources for teachers and all kinds of people who want to create experiences around science. And a digital department that writes original articles, and also a video department that creates works like the one we're going to be watching today, Breakthrough. So we're going to be watching one of the videos from Breakthrough Season 2. And the whole impetus for Breakthrough is essentially to show people that there are women in science who are doing fantastic work, and to inspire people to, if they are interested in the sciences, to find out a little bit more about what it's like to do that as a woman in science. In addition to this year, when we did our second season, we wanted to create a resource for anyone who was looking to talk about these issues in their spaces, so academic spaces or personal spaces. And so we created this inclusive action toolkit. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But if you want to learn more about the Breakthrough series, the toolkit, all of the other things, as well as watch some of the episodes from this season and season 1, you can do that at breakthroughfilms.org. All right, so that's enough a little bit about us, but I'd love to kick it over to Rakib to talk a little bit about Black In Neuro. Oop, Rakib, I think you are muted. I'm going to unmute you.
It's the saying of 2020. So as an organization, Black In Neuro is an organization that aims to celebrate the often overlooked contributions and excellence of Black individuals in neuroscience-related fields, while providing resources, professional development, and mentorship opportunities to support our community. You can find us on Twitter at Black In Neuro, or our website, blackinneuro.com, where you can read over 500 profiles of incredible Black in Neuro scientists, watch previous events, and find out about upcoming ones, including we have a mini conference taking place from November 2nd to 4th, which is completely free. And we want to encourage Black in Neuro undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, and faculty to submit their work to present at the conference. And the deadline for that is October 14th. We have incredible panels lined up on mentorship, professional development, navigating grad school applications during the pandemic. So please spread the word about this free conference. And because our team is incredible and really doesn't stop, we're also partnering with NeuroMatch Conference on October 26th to 30th to bring more Black in Neuro programming. I can say that on October 27th, we will be having a continuation of our panel from the summer on neuroracism, where we'll be discussing the ongoing biases and anti-Black racism that is currently embedded in our practices and interpretations of academic research. And so most of us are here for this superstar, Dr. Bianca Jones Marlin. So she is an assistant professor, an incoming assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, where her lab will open up in 2021. Congratulations, this is incredible. She is currently a postdoc in the laboratory of Nobel laureate, Dr. Richard Axel, where she investigates transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, or how traumatic experiences in parents affect the brain structure and behavior of their offspring. As a graduate student at New York University, she studied the love drug oxytocin and discovered that it helps change the way neurons communicate and respond to baby cries in a new mother, making them a more caring parent. Her passion for her work stems from her desire to utilize neurobiology and science of learning to understand how both positive and negative experiences in life dictate brain health, academic performance in students, and overall social well-being. And we're really also lucky to be joined in conversation with Sochi Garcia. She is the K-12 education program manager at Science Friday. You can see her popped up on the screen over here, where she focuses on supporting the inspiring efforts of educators of all types to engage students in science, engineering, math, and the arts. She can be seen making a mess with education director Ariel Zich, I hope I got the last name right, developing teacher trainings and programs and planning ways to connect Science Friday media to classrooms. And she is excited to introduce the Sci Friday community and world to amazing educators in their midst. So thank you for joining us, Sochi. And our conversation will be moderated by the brilliant Dr. Brielle Ferguson, who is a neuroscientist, a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University, where she works in a lab studying the intersection of attention impairments and seizures. And she is also the newly appointed program director for Black in Neuro. Yes.
So thank you all so much for joining us today. Just so excited you're all here.
Yes, cheers. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone at home, for tuning in. And I believe without further ado, we can start the film screening.
Let's do it. All right. Thank you again so much for everyone for joining us. So we're gonna play the film, and then afterwards, Dr. Bianca Jones Marlin is going to join us for the conversation. So hope you'll stick around for that. Kyle, who was playing our video, would you mind going back to the beginning and unmuting your microphone? That would be great. Thank you so much. Kyle, it looks like we're having some issue with our sound. Would you mind trying to unplug if you've got headphones? Would you mind unplugging those and see if that helps? We tested this before we started, team. We did. Sometimes things happen with live events, so thanks for sticking with us. We're still having trouble. I'm going to try one more thing. All right, we're having some difficulty with our video. Kyle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and reload that video. So I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen and try resharing it and see if that helps. All right, team, let's see if we can get this started. All right. Kyle, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Fantastic. We can hear you. All right. So I am.
Okay.
There we go. I think we've got it now. Let's try.
It's an interesting and I think humbling experience to see yourself reflected in another individual. They're going to have their own life experiences, but you look at them and you see yourself in the color of their eyes and the way their nose wrinkles. I have a 2-year-old daughter. She's taken care of by biology, by her parents. And it's just beautiful that we are set up for success and survival in that manner. And yet life is dynamic and the experience can sometimes be messy. What happens when things go wrong? And how do we fix that? I had the amazing opportunity to grow up in a very dynamic family. My biological parents were also foster parents. And so I had the opportunity to grow up with many siblings.
You've had over 20 some odd siblings with him. They learned to work with each other. They had some good days and they had some sibling days.
Mm-hmm. And then when we went to bed, I heard where my siblings came from and what they had to go through in order to be put in foster care. There were stories of abuse, of not getting the proper nutrition, the proper care that a child would need. Young kids shouldn't always have to go through the things they go through. So I almost feel as if it's my obligation to do something about it. Taking my passion for science and what I've learned from them and putting them together is really my end goal. My name is Bianca Jones Marlin. I'm a researcher at Columbia University, and I study how trauma is passed down through generations. During my graduate studies, I explored maternal behavior, specifically in female mice. In the case of the non-moms, when a pup is removed from its comfortable nest and begins to cry, she'll leave it there. And at times, she'll even cannibalize the pup. However, if a mom is present in the nest, even if it's not the mother of that pup, she'll go and she'll pick the pup up and she'll bring it back to the nest. So the goal of our study was to explore what was happening in the brain, what was responsible for that transition. When we treated mice who have never given birth with oxytocin, well above and beyond what the mice originally had, what we observed was astounding. We not only saw changes in the way their neurons fired and spoke to each other in the hearing centers of the brain. The mice would not ignore the pup or cannibalize the pup, but go to pick the pup up and bring the pup back to the nest. Prior to being a mother, my work in oxytocin still was so close to my heart, knowing that my siblings had parents who couldn't be the best moms and dads to them. And why could that be? What is a quote unquote bad or good parent? And how could we aid in that process? So my work now focuses on the stressors that you seemingly can't escape, how stress can affect not just an individual, but subsequent generations. All of the cells in the body have what we call epigenetic regulation, which means the cells know what they should and shouldn't be. But certain experiences, the environment, can change what genes are expressed and not expressed. That's because DNA actually is just the recipe, but it doesn't make the cake. Markers around the DNA say, you can't touch this piece. Or now you have access to this DNA, you will become a protein. So our genes don't change, but the things around our genes that make our genes work or not can change to adapt to the environment. So at the end of World War II, an experience called the Dutch hunger winter occurred. And during this time, people in the Netherlands were starved of food. Their children and their grandchildren were observed to suffer from increased rates of metabolic issues, for example, diabetes, high blood pressure, and even schizophrenia. It wasn't just children that were conceived during the famine, but children that were conceived afterwards, as if the sex cells, the sperm cells and the egg cells had a memory of that trauma, of that stress, well beyond the years of famine. It really did spark questions in the scientific community of how can a memory, a message live on in sperm and egg, and how is it being passed down? So that's an example of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. There have been a lot of questions surrounding epigenetics, transgenerational epigenetics, and that's because we're studying humans. A lot of this has to do with what we are reporting and our experiences with life. And so it's really hard to get pristine, clean data from history and experience. But when it comes to mice, we can take mice and put them in a controlled environment where the only thing that should be different is the experience that they're having. My end goal as a scientist is to make things better. And in this case, it's how to make a bad experience less traumatizing and dramatic for the organism and for subsequent generations. And in order to make things better, we first have to figure out what happens when things go wrong. And so what if we made a stressful situation with mice? How does that change the way their brain responds? This question started our experiments that we're doing now. They rely on smell very heavily. Neurons sense when a smell comes into their nose, like the smell of almond, and they begin to fire, and they'll tell other neurons in the brain that this is the smell of almond. And so what we do is we have the almond paired with shock. After the experience, the mouse starts to avoid that smell. We then go and look at the actual brain, and the cells in the nose actually respond to chemicals in the air. The structure of the cells are still there, they're still present, but we can see through the bone and we can see through the fats, and we can look at just the cells. From there, we put this tissue on something called a light sheet microscope. We're able to look at the whole tissue, and we're able to have a 3D rendering of the nose and a beautiful image of the actual cells in the nose. Everything that's in green here are cells that respond to almond. These are the first cells that say, oh, I smell something, and it sends that message to the brain. We go through and we count how many cells are in the tissue. So in the parents, after about a month, we start to see an increase in these cells that respond to the almond smell. And this is work that we're following up on. Former labs have shown, and we're looking at the mechanisms behind that. What's really exciting is that the pups seem to already be born with more cells that respond to almond. Because male mice are constantly creating sperm. This means that the experience is not just living in the sperm that's present, but somehow it's living somewhere in the body and informing the sperm to make sure that all subsequent generations are getting this message. So males, without ever meeting their offspring, just having their sperm pass on to the second generation, those offspring have altered brains because of the experience that their father went through. So it's a beautiful situation in which biology is preparing us for an environment that may or may not be there. And I think that's where the problem lies. Just this smell that elicit a response that it shouldn't elicit because there's no actual stressor there. But this is a proxy to the human experience, because during a traumatic event, we are still using our senses to create those memories. And what we're exploring is if these memories are actually then passed down to the subsequent generations and what that would look like biologically. When we look at our data, it's a little bit nerve-wracking because I go back and I think about how an experience I could have can be passed on. And not just an experience that I have, but that my husband, an experience that he could have had well before he met me, could still live on. And that could affect our offspring. We don't know. And that's the exciting and terrifying part. It needs to be answered. Me personally being Black American, knowing that my ancestors went through trauma for generations on generations, if my work can inform any aspect of the opportunity to live safe, happy, just life, and I'm happy with the direction in which my work is going.
Wow.
Amazing. That was
amazing.
every time you watch it.
Yeah, I've seen it multiple times now, and every time I'm just so blown away. This is one of those times where I really wish we were live, because you, Bianca, and Science Friday and the film producers all deserve such a tremendous round of applause. But you'll just have to take our word for it. We can see from the praise in the comments and from us, people are completely blown away. So I am so honored to be here and be able to chat with the amazing neuroscientist, Dr. Bianca Jones Marlin, star of our film today, Breakthrough the Trauma Tracer, and general inspiration to all of us, really. First off, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to talk with us today. And we're so thrilled to be able to have this conversation. Obviously, something that's central to the mission of Black in Neuro and near and dear to my heart is highlighting Black excellence. And you and your work and how it's depicted so beautifully in this film are just the epitome of that. So thank you. And we thank you for this opportunity. I also want to take a second to remind people, if they have questions, they can drop them in the chat and we'll try to answer some of them live. I thought we'd start by having you, Bianca, talk a little bit about how you fell in love with science and neuroscience in particular. For many of us Black and otherwise marginalized scientists, we often might lack cultural access to role models in STEM. So many of us might grow up not even knowing what a neuron is, let alone be planning to pursue a graduate degree or get a PhD or pursue a career in science. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you fell in love with science and when you knew you wanted to be a neuroscientist.
Thank you, Brielle. And thank you again, Sci-Fi and Black in Neuro, for the amazing work that you're doing to highlight scientists so that other people can know that scientists exist, that other people can know that my research exists and that I exist. It's a platform that I'm eternally grateful to, so thank you. I did not always know that science or scientist was something that I could be or was an actual job, truth be told. I started off as adolescent education. In high school, and I realized I reflected on this today when I was getting ready for this talk, but in high school I thought because I love science, I have to be a science teacher. That makes the most sense. I don't want to be a doctor per se, but maybe that's an option. But I wanted to be a science teacher because I love science, and that's what you do. That's the only way you can be a scientist. And so when I started in college, I went to Central Islip High School, CI, one of my highlights of my developmental years, and decided to go to St. John's University in Queens. And when I was there, I remember walking down the hall of my science department, because I was science, biology, and adolescent education. And I saw a flyer that said, "Do you want a scholarship to continue on in the sciences?" Yes. You don't say no to free money, especially as a freshman in college. And so I went to this meeting, and they spoke about how one could get a PhD, a doctor of philosophy, and that could aid you in this process of getting money. And I realized I was in the wrong meeting, because philosophy is cool, but that's not like what I wanted to do with life. And I did not know that a doctor of philosophy was directly associated with science or scientist or neurobiologist. I loved education. I feel strongly and will always feel strongly that education should be equalized in the United States. And so I wanted to go into education. I still am certified to be a teacher, as well as public policy. And through this program, two of them, one called Initiative for Maximizing Student Development through the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the other one being the Ronald McNair Scholars, after the Ronald McNair Black astronaut who went up in the Challenger and died in 1986. These two programs really helped open my eyes to the realm of research, that I could be a scientist, that it's an actual job. And when I realized that that was an option, I think I dove totally in, and I did summer programs that allowed me to, paid me and allowed me to survive as a college student, one at Vanderbilt, one at MIT, and that opened my eyes to like different institutions in the whole world that I just did not know existed. And so when I graduated similar to a financial, space that certain graduates are dealing with now. Mine was 2009, the economic crisis. And so there weren't many jobs available, but I found out that I could apply to grad school. And that just really started the wheel of saying, you can actually go this direction and be a certified scientist. It's an actual thing. And I can live my passion of figuring out how people learn, how brains learn. And also be a teacher, because I'm also a professor.
I love that. Thank you. We also had some people pre-submit questions for you, so I'm going to share one of those now. Since your work shows that traumatic experiences are inherited through epigenetic modifications, which, by the way, was explained and illustrated just beautifully in the film. Through your work, have you identified any particular modifications that you might be able to target to normalize some of the brain and behavioral changes that you're observing?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. There's so much unknown when it comes to epigenetics. They highlighted in the film that this is only after World War II that we really started to see these elements maintained and studied well in humans. And so to look at those intricacies that could be happening biologically, it's really a frontier that has not been fully touched. And so there are many aspects that we're looking at. The video covered a little bit, something called RNA. So DNA and RNA are what make our proteins in our body. But when these things can be read or not read, it changes the way the brain develops. It changes the way we navigate life because our brain is really a main focus for our behavior. And so we're really looking at changes in those DNA and RNA, but mostly changes in the brain and changes in behavior. And that will lead us back to what's happening with the molecular changes. Excellent question.
In the example you gave in the film of the Dutch hunger winter, there were documented cases of not just children of people involved, but grandchildren who suffered from increased metabolic issues and psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia. So we had a question from the audience member, Jared Boyce, asking how far do those epigenetic modifications actually last? So for example, in your work, how far or for how many generations do you see the memory of the almond smell?
It's a beautiful question. And so in our work, we're looking at males, we're looking at male mice. But I say that to highlight the fact that my former work looking at maternal behavior was with female mice. And the reason why we chose specifically to look at male mice is because in the video, I was actually pregnant with my son, who's now 5 months old. But when I was pregnant with my daughter developed the eggs of her potential daughters inside of her. So an experience that happens to me could essentially easily affect my granddaughter because of that lineage, my daughter being inside of me and then her eggs already being developed. The crazy part about our work is that when it comes to male mice, their sex cells, their sperm cells, turn over every month, every 21 days. So there's a message that's being maintained somewhere else in the body that continually informs the sperm and then informs the subsequent generations. And so we're really focusing on that, what that could be. I haven't tied on and looked at like generation 6 or 7, which is easier in mice than it is in humans, of course. And with the Dutch hunger winter, we're only looking at the 3rd generation because that's who's been born. But we're really focusing even on just the 1st generation, what that message can be that's maintained. Because if you can remember that, if something in the body can remember that over 3 months, that's already within itself amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing. So let's shift gears a little bit and discuss motherhood. You have a gorgeous baby girl, which we had the opportunity to see a few times throughout the film. I wonder if you could discuss balancing motherhood and the pressures of being a scientist, and also speak a little bit more about how motherhood has actually informed your research.
Thank you for that. I sigh deeply because the word balance always is jarring. I don't know what that means, but I know that I have a purpose as a mother and a purpose as a scientist and a purpose as a wife. And those 3 things, I really aim to make sure that they inform each other. So when I'm doing excellent work, when I'm away from my family and I'm giving talks, and now it's not too hard because we're doing Zoom talks. When I formerly used to travel, I would see that as a way of honoring my family by doing the best I could do on the job. When I'm doing late nights in lab and I'm not with my babies, I'm not putting my 5-month-old son to sleep. I'm saying I'm dedicating this time in lab and I'm honoring the work I'm going to do well, because that's the only reflection I can do as a mother, not being there. Similarly, when I'm with my family, I want to make sure I'm using my science to inform my management as a mom, and making sure that I give them the attention that they deserve and they need. And also my attention that I deserve and need, because I can't do it all. Everyone has 100% of time. And every time another child is added in, you still have that 100% of time. It's just subtracted a little bit for every aspect. And so giving myself the freedom to say, I can be the best mom even when it's 40%. I can be the best scientist even when it's 40%, and optimizing on that. So it really is not a balance where it's 50% mom and 50% science, because then there's no percentage Bianca. But it's really when I'm in it, I'm focused in it. And when I'm doing something else, I'm focused in that. and also giving myself the flexibility to say it's okay to be a scientist and not put your kids to bed. It's okay to be a mom and not be in lab at 8 p.m. All of those things are okay.
I love that. And I love that you acknowledge kind of practicing grace with yourself and self-care with yourself. It's beautiful. We have another question from an audience member. If we could go ahead and queue it up. Okay, we had a question on whether there are studies focused on Black maternity and the impact that the potential stress and trauma of 2020 has had on pregnancy and newborns during this year.
Excellent question. And of course, because we're in 2020, these data are still rolling in. But we do know that Black women are more likely to die during pregnancy than white women. And that number is increased. I just heard recently up to 12 times more likely to die in New York City, where we have the South Bronx, which is per capita in the United States, the most impoverished, but also most highly Black populated place in the United States. And those numbers scare me as a New Yorker mom who also had predicaments during birth. And no matter what level of degree of education, of letters I have after my name, I noted that there were aspects that were unfair, reasons that I was sent home that I should not have been sent home for, that it's hard to separate from systemic racism. And so these studies are, of course, rolling in, but we know these data. And if the case is where Black women are more likely to die, and this is in comparison to white women, there has to be some aspect that potentially is epigenetic. Because for generations, we have seen ultimate stress of a human population. And even now, if we're talking about not just Black Americans who are ADOS, African descendants of slavery, but those who have come over from other countries who are Black in the United States, the continual stressor of institutionalized racism plays a role epigenetically. And as much as I love studying the work I'm doing in mice, and I relate it directly to my siblings, I think as an onus to my siblings and what I've heard they've gone through, there is a bigger direction with my work when it comes to humanity and respecting humanity and respecting mothers. And so I think it's an excellent question. And I wish we had more data, kind of. I also wish this wasn't the case and it was something we didn't have to look into, but it is, and it's essential to study.
Thank you. Going back to what you mentioned about the studies on the Dutch hunger winter and that population and their offspring, are there any other current studies or follow-ups going on in other populations that have undergone trauma, such as African Americans and descendants of slaves?
This, I think, this question highlights the importance of inclusivity in science. I would assume that part of the reason why I'm interested in what I'm studying is because of my unique experience of being a sibling to foster kids, to foster siblings, of being a Black American. Majority of the studies that have been done have looked at Jewish population. Majority of the scientists that are doing this are Jewish. There are studies that are looking at Chinese post-1950, where there was a famine, and looking at how that starvation has played a role in Chinese populations, done by Chinese scientists. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is also important. And that's why we need to make sure we have inclusivity in science, because there are very few people studying this aspect in ADOS, in Black Americans, and in Blacks overall.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take another question that was pre-submitted from an audience member. So you discussed in the film that the brain differences that you saw were in the hearing or auditory centers, but we also know that the prefrontal cortex is particularly vulnerable to a range of insults, with stress being a major one. So this person was curious whether you might have also observed changes in the prefrontal cortex and whether that might have been reflected in cognitive symptoms in some of your experiments.
Thank you. So the prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that's known to organize what we call executive function. So quote unquote, higher order decision-making, et cetera. The brain also works in concert. So I was looking at, first and foremost, the hearing centers of the brain called the primary auditory cortex, and how that changes between a mother and a virgin, and making a virgin pretty much into a mom by changing those centers. And I'm now looking at the nose, the smell centers, the olfactory centers, specifically called the main olfactory epithelium. That's also a sensory area. I'm focusing on these two sensory areas because they're one of the first order areas in which the external environment is calculated into the brain. Those senses will then go on to further areas in the brain. And we know the brain works in concert. So specifically, have I looked at the prefrontal cortex? Not yet. And it's not just the prefrontal cortex. It's going to be the prefrontal cortex and other areas in the brain. And I hope that the work that I'm doing, looking at more primary sensory areas, will inform those who are expertises in the prefrontal cortex, in the amygdala that's associated with emotion, in the hippocampus that's associated with memory, to really inform their research. You're muted, Bria.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from the audience. This one's from Chase Alston. They asked, are there any other studies on the success of interventions that address or possibly reverse the effects of trauma-induced epigenetic changes?
Thank you, Chase. Yes, so in the psychology and psychiatry realm, there are practices that have been established for periods of years in which you can remember the experience that was traumatic and attempt to replace those memories or pair those memories with something less traumatic. And this really has motivated the work that we do. It'd be great to have the odor, something that was associated with trauma, reassociated with something less traumatic, and see how that actually changes the brain. And if that actually changes the cells in the main olfactory epithelium and the smell areas. So we are borrowing work that's been established in psychology and psychiatry and try to apply it to the biological components, because although in practice it's been done, we don't know what the mechanisms look like. We don't know how the brain actually changes. So it's really working together with all fields of science to come to that answer.
All right, we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about being a Black woman in science. And so, as you know, being a Black person, being a Black woman in science can be incredibly lonely and isolating. So I wonder how you have navigated that, and if you might have any other tips for other Black women who are aspiring scientists.
Thank you for that. It can be extremely lonely. Although I am American and I speak English, sometimes there are times when I felt like I didn't, or I wasn't, or it wasn't the same. But I have allowed myself to find a community of people that may not be Black or may not be women, but we find connections in other ways. And that has had to be what is established. It doesn't cure the loneliness. It doesn't cure the conversations that are known with Black people. The same way people who are coming from a different country, you just can't speak your native language in lab if the person doesn't speak the language. But you can come to the realization that you guys can still enjoy coffee, enjoy play dates, enjoy a drink after lab, because there are other things that you can relate to. So I really focused heavily on those other relations that I can establish, as well as invite my Black counterparts that I've met through Black In Neuro. Brielle, let me know when you're in New York City, because in those aspects, that's how you invite the people who you know exist into your realm. And so it's definitely twofold, accepting that it may not be a diverse place, neuroscience, diverse specifically when it comes to Black and brown, BIPOC, but we still have to be here and we still have to survive. So instead of not, I'm optimizing.
Thank you. I'm putting that in my Google Calendar now.
Yeah, please.
I can't wait. Okay. We had a question from an aspiring scientist, from Megan Ryder. She is an undergrad who's looking to get a PhD in the field of neuroscience. And she wonders, what would you say is the most important thing to do as an applicant to show grad schools that you're capable of working in the field and in neuroscience?
I love this question because it's not, although it's far removed from where I was, like over a decade, it's not that far from my heart. I remember being at that cusp of saying, like, what do I do next? Do I become a teacher? Do I go into grad school? And what does that look like? And do I know what I'm doing? And I did it to a certain extent. I applied to like 3 schools kind of on a whim, and worked out that NYU was ideal and worked out properly. First thing I would do is I would definitely recommend to find a mentor who has gone through this. And if that's me, then you can find me later. But just find someone who has already applied to graduate school, who understands the process, who understands you, and who knows you as a person and what you'd be interested in and where you would thrive and what area you would thrive and what place, literal place you would thrive. And that I think would be first and foremost paramount, finding someone who has gone through this before. Secondly, I would maybe take heart, maybe not, depending on how it interacted with you. But science lab in college is not the same as science on the field. So understanding that if you can get your hands in some type of science in the lab component, and understanding like that it fails majority of the time, that it is dynamic, and every day you just have to breathe in deep and know that you're going into the unknown, and have that background. People look for that because they know it's not easy. And so I would say those two things, finding a mentor and then having a little bit of lab experience, in which is not just college bio lab, but actual lab, would definitely aid in the process. And have people read over your application.
Definitely. Thank you. We had another question from the audience from Tyler Bonin. They were wondering, what do we know about the constraints on what can actually be remembered and passed down? So the experiments so far have been more low dimensional sensory cues. So is there kind of they said a representational bottleneck in what the genome can encode?
Oh my, it gives me chills, that question. What do we actually remember from our ancestors? It's an excellent question. How do we go about answering that? I start by answering the simpler questions of sensory experience, because it's something that we can target. But when it comes to a flashback or a fear that may not be able to be just odor or just sound, it's a dynamic question. Not much has been progressed in the field when it comes to it, because it is so intricate, but it's an amazing question. I hope that my research helps to inform that. Sorry, we can't give you a full on like, yes, it's there, because it's such a scary but also inspiring question.
Yeah, it's a huge question, but great answer. Next, I wanted to take the opportunity to bring in our second panelist, Suchi Garcia. Suchi, as you heard in the beginning, is the brains behind the toolkit, and it would be great if you could start by telling us a little bit about why you wanted to create the toolkit in the first place, and how you think it relates to some of the issues that we're discussing today in the Breakthrough series as a whole.
Hi, thank you. I got a little emotional. I always get a little emotional watching Bianca's video, just because it's such an amazing story. And I think one of the things behind the toolkit and creating the toolkit is that life experience, your identity, intersectionality is what is going to make STEM better, which it's what's going to deepen the field. And I think that ignoring that for so long has stunted science in a lot of ways. And so we can only get better by being more inclusive in STEM. So the idea behind the toolkit is not to answer all the questions, because that has to be done by a community. It's just a collection of beginnings. It's things that people have thrown at the wall to try and see what sticks. And basically, it's a series of strategies or approaches that people have tried in order to break down institutional racism and inequity. And it's a place for everyone to find a starting conversation in what needs to change at their institution. So there are pieces that are intended for structural change, larger change in higher education. And there are pieces that are for those of us who are still navigating that space and trying to find entry and trying to protect yourself. And Bianca, you talked about this a little bit, right? This idea of finding a community, optimizing, which is necessarily what has to happen while the work to break down a lot of these structural inequities happens. So the toolkit is really just a place to go to start that conversation with people at different levels or tiers at your institution. And even if your institution is not starting anything, doesn't have a diversity office, doesn't have a place for those conversations to begin, to say like, hey, there's a resource that has been created. I just want to bring in the caveat. The toolkit actually isn't my brainchild. It is the brainchild of a group, of a community, and it's an ongoing brainchild of a community. So we know that iteration and collaboration is the heart of anything good that is going to happen to create change. And so we're running open iteration and feedback sessions on the toolkit and trying to get as many voices and opinions and strategies in it as possible. So that's going to be work ongoing through the rest of the fall, winter, and spring. in order to bring a big community voice into that piece.
Great, thank you. It sounds like it's kind of for everyone, but do you have a particular type of person that you hope will use and benefit from the toolkit?
That's hard to say. Yes, we do. I mean, I really hope that it's something that gets picked up in leadership in higher education. So people who have the purse strings in their hands. Dr. Jones Marlin, you talked about scholarships that were available. You talked about opportunities in lab. And so confronting some of these monetary structural barriers that are put in place is really important. And so I really, really hope that this helps people to start a conversation with people who have that type of power in their institutions, but also helps people form and support communities like Black In Neuro, and like a lot of other organizations that are popping up to provide affinity networks, to provide that type of community support that's now happening.
Great, thank you. And this one is for both of you. It's from Lisa Thole-Hetler. She asked, what advice would you give to educators to help increase participation in the sciences for young women of color? Bianca, if you wanted to start.
I'll start by saying invite us. Let us know that we're invited into the space. You will not be able to establish the fact that the space is going to be safe, because the space may not be safe. There's no need to lie to us about that. But let us know that you're taking steps in that direction. And that first step is by inviting us, and letting us know that if we're not welcome, which you can't control because you can't control the establishment of the institution, that at least we're invited. Not to let it be okay, but if we're Black in STEM, we're used to it. We know it. So instead of trying to protect us from that and saying, well, we're not going to invite this person because, we're still working on this, don't wait for it to be changed within your institution. We will bring the change into your institution because we know that culture, and we will bring that cultural change. All the while, you should be doing the work. But don't wait till the work is established to invite us in, because that may not happen. So just invite us.
Suchi, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so we have a piece of the toolkit that is about ending out weed out cultures, auditing your syllabi, looking at representation within your courses and who you're talking about and who you're representing, and really just like kind of ditching these outdated perspectives on who, and like re-examining your own bias. And I think those are important steps to take, but I really think this idea of like how you are weeding students out of STEM is something we really need to confront, because it's creating these barriers to entry that I don't know if they're actually accurate. If you don't feel invited in the space, if you don't feel like you can grow and try, it's hard to feel included. It is hard to feel like you have entry. So there are a lot of these barriers that we've done to identify talent, and I put talent in quotes, and it's a cover for a lot of structural racism. It's a cover for a lot of inequity. And so really thinking about what we mean when we say a student is talented in STEM or has an affinity for it, or whether you have done enough to connect with them and how it's relevant culturally for them and how they can bring their whole selves into the space, I think is an important step to take.
Okay. We had a comment that I just wanted to bring up that I think we can just discuss from Catherine. She said that PIs should start paying undergrads for research because not doing this can act as a barrier to entry for underprivileged students that can't afford to just volunteer their time. So what advice might you have for academia in trying to change that? And why aren't we doing that?
Coming from academia, which we all dabble in, we know that the funds are there. It's not like it may be a barrier. It 100% is a barrier. I would not have done any job in undergraduate if I were not being paid for it. And I worked at IHOP before I started graduate school to pay for first month's rent. I did not have the flexibility to say, let me check this out. I was attracted to the things that had a financial gain that also benefited me educationally. But equally, I would have done the things that had financial gain because you have to buy books for next semester. So Catherine, you bring up one of the paramount, most amazing points. A way to level the playing field is to understand that not everyone has, the connection of having money funneled into their bank account during undergraduate careers. And we have the institutions that have money, and there are other institutions outside that are private that have money. So honoring the fact that the work should be paid for with your undergraduates and beyond it's paramount.
Sochi, did you want to add something?
Yeah, similar in the toolkit, we say prioritize compensation. It is, similar to Bianca, I didn't do any job in undergrad if I was not paid for it because I couldn't afford it. There was no safety net. And there are people with different situations, but you're creating one of those artificial barriers when there is money to do that thing. The other thing I would say in that is also like when you're engaging in this work of inclusion, you also need to pay people to do that work as well. You cannot ask by POCs to do that work for free. Everyone should be compensated for their time. And by doing that, you open up more opportunity, but you're also valuing people's brains, their space, their intellectual, all the intellectual work they are doing to contribute to that.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and this one is for Bianca. So your work studies mechanisms of how we pass on trauma, but I'm curious if you could share whether we know if there are similar processes at play for inheritance of positive experiences or positive traits. Early in the film, one of the first things I was struck by was hearing your mother discuss being a foster parent and just thinking about the extraordinary levels of compassion that takes to even want to do something like that. And then you see someone like you're your mother's daughter, and the type of work that you do and the compassion that you really radiate, you have to wonder, is there a potential for a kind of transgenerational inheritance of positive experiences and traits and a way for those mechanisms that you found in your work to work for good? So I wonder if you could speak about what we know on passing on positive traits like compassion, or even of particular relevance for Black Americans, resilience, and how neuroscience might be better working to understand that.
Excellent question. And I'm moved emotionally by hearing it. It's hard to separate the nature and the nurture, right? And this is what I want my work to do, to see how much of this component is nurture, how much of epigenetics, which heavily is nurture, but with genetic components, and how much of it is just your DNA, which doesn't change. Yes, my parents are foster parents. My mom and dad are foster parents. And before I gave birth to my 5-month-old, we were foster parents ourselves. We had our first foster daughter. And it moves me emotionally because I know that had to do with observing the change it could make, not just in the life of the foster sibling or foster daughter or son that you're bringing in, but our lives as kids in the Jones house, having the opportunity to meet people of different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, that were living with us as 300% equal. They were our siblings. They ate the same bad meatloaf that my mom made that we did, and we all had to go to bed at the same time. And to have that forced interaction become so natural, I know that it was I assume epigenetic, but I know like emotionally and mentally changing for me. And I want to make sure that we pass that along. Now it's hard to separate, as I said, the nature versus nurture. And we know that the nature component is real and there. So I hope that my work influences what the smallest mechanism is when it comes to that. How much of the positivity is coming in from living in that environment, living in that house? And if you're separated from that house, how much of that do you maintain? The positivity question is important. And I want it to, especially resilience, and I want to study it in the future. But right now I feel that the negative component is so pressing that with my time right now, I really want to focus on that.
Thank you so much for that, your work, and that was just a beautiful answer. Unfortunately, that's about all we have time for. So first, I want to thank Bianca for taking the time to be here with us today, and Suchi for sharing information about what seems like will be a really incredible resource for the academic community. Thank you to Science Friday for creating this important film and this series and for allowing us to share space with you today. Before we close, can both of you share where people can find you and your work, like your social media website?
Thank you. So I'm on Twitter. I'm at BJ Marlin, BJ Marlin, and on Instagram at Bianca Jones Marlin. And I love to hear more about the work that you're doing, your interests as future scientists potentially in my lab, let me know, and your passions for life. So thank you so much. And thank you, Breakthrough. Thank you, Sci-Fi. And thank you, Black In Neuro.
And if you're interested in following more of the films, Bianca is one of the scientists we featured, but we also have 5 other films about 5 other women in science doing amazing things. You can find all those films at breakthroughfilms.org. You can also follow us at Sci-Fi on Twitter, and sciencefriday.com, our website, has a lot of our media, and also follow-up interview and more information about Bianca's work as well.
Thank you. For everyone who didn't get to attend, the video will be archived on YouTube and our website. For everyone who registered for today's event, be sure to check your inbox for a post-event follow-up survey. For Black In Neuro, we're just getting started, so any and all feedback you can give us for how we can improve our future events will be incredibly useful for us as we move forward. You can find more on us on our website at blackinneuro.com, and you can find us on social media, both Twitter and Instagram at Black In Neuro. And on behalf of all of us at Black In Neuro and Science Friday, thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.